Callum had nothing but a dying farm and a decade of silence. The last person who should have begged him was the Orc Bandit bleeding behind his woodpile, one of the Red Scar raiders. But her amber eyes held only surrender. "Food, please," he knelt. Without bargaining, without fear. He gave her bread and said, "You're the first person who's asked me for anything in 10 years. Stay, there's more." Callum was a failed farmer, invisible to the world, a man whose own village forgot he existed. She was a Red Scar raider, part of the crew that had been burning homesteads in the valley for months. If anyone discovered her behind his woodpile, he'd be hanged for harboring an enemy. But the real danger wasn't the gallows. It was the question neither of them had dared to ask in years. What happens when two people the world threw away decide to save each other? Because the bandit hadn't come to raid. She'd come to die, cast out by her own kind for a crime no one expected. Mercy, Callum's farm, stood at the edge of Thornwood, a patch of dirt the village had long stopped including on maps. The roof sagged. The well ran dry every August. His only companion was a goat named Bramble, who followed him more out of habit than loyalty. For 10 years, he had moved through the market square like a ghost. No one greeted him. No one traded with him. No one even met his eyes. He was the man who had tried and failed, and in a world that measured worth by yield, failure made you invisible. The villagers didn't hate him. They simply forgot he was breathing. But Callum remembered everything. He remembered the year his wife died of fever because the apothecary refused credit. He remembered the banker who took his milking cow as collateral and the neighbors who watched from behind curtained windows. He remembered the specific weight of silence, the way a whole community could look past a man until he stopped believing he deserved to be seen. So when he found the orc crouched in the shadow of his woodpile, bleeding through a gash that would have killed most, he recognized something. Not the armor or the clan markings, the hollowed-out emptiness in her eyes. He'd worn that same look for a decade. Her name was Urzara, not that she told him. Not at first. She was too busy dying. The wound in her side had been made by a serrated blade, the kind her own crew favored. Red Scar raiders didn't take prisoners, and they didn't leave survivors. Urzara had been both. 3 nights earlier, during a raid on a merchant caravan, she had done the unforgivable. She hesitated. A human child, barely 6, had stumbled out of a burning wagon, and Urzara, a raider with 12 confirmed kills, had thrown herself between the child and her captain's axe. The child escaped. Urzara was beaten, stabbed, and left in a ditch for the crows. She had crawled for 2 days on broken ribs, following the smell of wood smoke, hoping for a barn where she could die alone. Instead, she found Callum. He didn't ask her questions. He lifted her, half-carried her into the house, and laid her on a pallet by the hearth. The fire had been cold since spring. He couldn't afford kindling, but he lit it now with the last of his stored pine. He cleaned the wound with boiled water and strips torn from his own shirt. He fed her bread soaked in goat's milk, 1 spoonful at a time, while Bramble the goat watched from the corner with the judgmental stare of an animal who had seen this man do many foolish things and had long since stopped trying to intervene. Urzara's fever broke on the 3rd morning. She opened her eyes to a room that smelled of dust and old sorrow, and to a human man whose face held no fear. She reached for the knife at her belt. Gone, he had removed it while she slept, not as a threat, but as a practicality. It lay on the table, cleaned and sharpened, next to a heel of bread. "I'm not going to hurt you," Callum said. "If I wanted to, I'd have done it while you were unconscious." "Eat." She stared at the bread, then at him. Her voice, when it came, was a rasp. "You should have let me die. I'm Red Scar. Your kind burns our bodies. You're not Red Scar anymore, he said. You told me in your sleep about the child you tried to save, about the captain who left you bleeding. You're clanless. The word landed like a stone. Clanless, the Orcish equivalent of being unwritten from existence. Without a clan, an Orc had no protection, no name, no afterlife. To be cast out was worse than execution. Urzara turned her face to the wall, and for the first time since she was a child, she wept. Not from pain, from the unbearable weight of being seen by someone who had no reason to look. But Thornwood was not a forgiving place, and secrets had short lifespans. The village constable, a man named Harlan, had grown suspicious. He'd noticed smoke from Callum's chimney for 3 nights running, more than the farmer had burned in years. He'd noticed the tracks from the woodpile to the door, too wide and deep for a human. And he'd noticed that the Red Scar raids had stopped suddenly, as if the whole crew had vanished from the valley. Harlan was not a clever man, but he was a resentful one, and he had spent years waiting for a reason to finally punish the failure who embarrassed the village with his continued existence. Now, he believed he had one. On the 4th night, Harlan gathered 5 men from the tavern, farmers whose barns had been spared, tradesmen who'd lost nothing, all of them hungry for the righteousness that comes from destroying someone weaker than themselves. They armed themselves with pitchforks and torches and marched toward the crumbling farm on the edge of town. Inside, Callum was teaching Urzara how to feed Bramble without startling her. The goat had accepted the orc with surprising ease. Goats, after all, do not care about clan politics. Urzara's hands, which had once held a raider's axe, were now cupping grain for a stubborn animal, and she was laughing, a sound she had not made in 15 years. Callum watched her and felt something he'd thought was dead: hope. It was the last quiet moment they would have, because Harlan's torches were already visible through the window. Harlan's voice cut through the night before his face appeared, the bark of a man who had waited years for permission to be cruel. Callum, we know you're harboring one of them. Bring her out and we might let you keep the roof over your head. The other men fanned out behind him, torches hissing in the rain that had just begun to fall, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the mud. Bramble bleated from the barn, alarmed. Urzara rose from the pallet, her hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Her body, still weak from the wound, swayed, but her eyes had hardened into the amber fire Callum had seen on that first night, the fire of a cornered predator. "I'll go out," she said. "They only want me. You can survive this." Callum looked at the door. He looked at the woman who had been clanless for less than a week and was already offering to die for a man she barely knew. Then he did something that surprised them both. He laughed, not bitterly, lightly, like a man remembering a joke he'd forgotten he knew. "I've been invisible for 10 years, he said. "I think it's time I let them see me." He opened the door. The mob tensed, expecting the orc. Instead, they got a man in a threadbare tunic, standing in the rain with the calm of someone who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. Harlan stepped forward, pitchfork angled like a spear. "Where is she, Callum?" "We saw the tracks." "Hand her over, and this ends quietly." Callum tilted his head. "You've never spoken my name before tonight. In 10 years, not once. Now you come to my door with torches because you think I'm hiding a monster. But the only monster I see is wearing a constable's badge." Harlan's face flushed crimson. The farmers behind him shifted, uncertain. They had expected a coward, not a confrontation. One of them, a younger man named Tomas, lowered his torch slightly. "We just want to be safe," Tomas said, his voice wavering. "The Red Scar killed my uncle's family last spring. We can't let them hide here. She's not Red Scar anymore, Callum said. She was cast out, left to die. She saved a human child, and her own crew tried to gut her for it. You want safe? She's the safest thing in this valley because she's the only one who's learned what mercy costs. He stepped aside, revealing the open doorway behind him where Uzara stood. One hand braced against the frame, the other wrapped around her wounded side. The mob saw her, not as a raider, but as a wounded woman shivering in the rain. The torchlight caught the tears still drying on her face, the gauntness of starvation, the careful way she held herself like someone who expected to be struck at any moment. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of rain on burning pitch. But Harlan wasn't there for truth. He was there for satisfaction. He lunged forward, pitchfork aimed at Uzara's chest, and the world slowed. Callum's hand moved, not as a farmer, but as something else entirely. He intercepted the shaft, twisted it with a precision that snapped Harlan's wrist, and in the same motion drove the constable to his knees in the mud. The movement was clean, economical, the kind of technique that took a decade of training to master. The other men stumbled backward. Tomas dropped his torch. "What?" Harlan gasped, clutching his broken wrist. "What are you?" Callum stood over him, breathing evenly, the rain plastering his gray hair to his skull. For 10 years, he had been the village failure, the man who couldn't keep a wife alive or a farm solvent. Now his eyes held something older and far more dangerous. 20 years ago, Callum said, before I came to Thornwood, I was a captain in the King's Vanguard. I trained men to kill orcs. I led raids into the Highlands. I have more blood on my hands than your entire lineage combined. I came here to disappear, to become someone who couldn't hurt anyone ever again. But you've made that impossible." He released Harlan's arm and stepped back. "So here is what's going to happen. You're going to go back to the village and tell them the orc is under my protection. The Red Scar are gone. They fled the valley after they cast her out. And if anyone else comes to my door with a torch, I will remind them why I was the man they sent when they needed monsters killed." The mob retreated, dragging Harlan with them, his threats reduced to whimpers. Tomas paused at the edge of the yard, looking back at the orc and the farmer standing together in the rain. "I'm sorry," he said, not quite sure who he was apologizing to. Then he vanished into the dark. When the door closed, Uzara collapsed against the wall, the adrenaline that had kept her upright finally failing. Callum caught her, lowered her to the floor, and she looked at him with eyes that had seen a new layer of the man she'd been rescued by. "You were a soldier," she said. "You killed my kind. Yes, but you didn't kill me. You fed me. You weren't my kind anymore either." The rain continued through the night, drumming on the leaking roof, filling the buckets Callum had placed around the room. But something had shifted. In the confession of his past, Callum had broken the seal on a decade of silence. And Uzara, who had come to die, now found herself in the company of the only human in the valley who understood what it meant to be clanless, because he had been living it himself long before she crawled to his woodpile. The next morning, Tomas returned. Alone, he brought a sack of grain, a jar of honey, and a bundle of clean bandages. "My mother was a healer before the fever took her," he said, not meeting Callum's eyes. "I know a little, if you'll let me help." Callum looked at Uzara, who nodded once. So the farmer, the orc, and the village boy, who had almost helped burn them alive, sat down at the scarred wooden table and began to tend wounds, both the ones that bled and the ones that didn't. But Harlan had not gone home to lick his wounds. He had ridden through the night to the garrison at Eastmarch, where a detachment of the king's army was stationed to monitor the border. He told them a story, heavily embellished, of a dangerous orc raider being sheltered by a traitor who had once been a vanguard captain gone rogue. The captain of the garrison, a man named Aldrich, was young, ambitious, and desperate for a victory to distinguish his posting. He saw an opportunity. By noon, 30 soldiers were marching toward Thornwood, their orders to capture the Orc and arrest the farmer for sedition. The stakes had just escalated from a village mob to the crown. At the farm, Tomas was changing Urzara's bandage when they heard the drums, the rhythmic thunder of soldiers on the march. Callum went to the window. 30 men, armed with steel and crossbows, advancing in formation. He recognized the discipline instantly because he had once taught it. Aldrich was at their head, a captain's crest on his breastplate, his face set with the righteous conviction of a man who believed his cause was just. "They've sent the garrison," Callum said quietly. Harlan must have ridden to Eastmarch. Urzara struggled to her feet. "I should have left last night. I've brought this on you." "No," Callum said, turning from the window. "I brought this on myself the moment I stopped being invisible. That's not your burden." He walked to the corner of the room, knelt beside a loose floorboard that Urzara had never noticed, and pried it open. Inside was a chest, covered in dust, untouched for years. He opened it. She saw the gleam of steel, a vanguard officer's blade, polished and deadly, alongside a captain's insignia and a sealed document bearing the royal seal. "You still have your sword," she breathed. "I buried it, not destroyed it. I knew that burying the past doesn't make it stay buried. I just hoped I'd never have to dig it up." He strapped the blade to his hip with the ease of a man who had worn it for decades. The weight settled against his thigh like a long-lost limb. "Tomas, take Urzara to the root cellar. There's a false wall in the back. It leads to an old escape tunnel I dug when I first moved here. It comes out behind the ridge. Get her somewhere safe." "I'm not leaving you," Urzara said, her voice cracking. "You're not a soldier anymore, Callum. Neither are you. But some things don't go away just because we stop wearing the uniform." Aldrich's voice boomed from outside. "Callum Ashford, by order of the Crown, you are commanded to surrender the Orc Raider and submit yourself for questioning. If you comply, no harm will come to your property." A pause. "If you resist, this farm will be reduced to ash." Callum stepped out the door, alone, his sword still sheathed, his hands raised in a gesture of parley. But Aldrich was not interested in parley. He was interested in trophies. The moment Callum appeared, a crossbowman on the flank loosed a bolt. It was aimed at Callum's chest, but Urzara, who had refused to hide, who had followed him out despite Tomas's protests, threw herself in front of him. The bolt struck her shoulder, spinning her to the ground. Callum's world went red. 20 years of suppressed violence, 20 years of burying the monster he'd been, erupted. He drew his blade and moved through the soldiers like a man who had forgotten how to lose. Within seconds, 3 men were disarmed, 2 were on the ground, and Aldrich was staring down the point of a vanguard captain's sword. "You wanted a monster," Callum said, his voice ice. "Here I am." But the true pivot wasn't the fight. It was what happened next. While Callum held Aldrich at blade point, Tomas emerged from the house carrying something that stopped everyone cold. It was the sealed document from the chest, and he was reading it aloud, his voice trembling but clear. "By order of King Aldrin III, dated the 12th year of his reign, Captain Callum Ashford of the King's Vanguard is hereby pardoned for all actions undertaken in the Highland Campaign, and honored for his service in ending the Orc Wars. He is granted the title of Lord Protector Emeritus and the right to live in peace wherever he chooses, under the Crown's eternal protection." The soldiers froze. Aldrich's face went white. He had been sent to arrest a traitor, but the man before him was a decorated war hero with a royal pardon signed by the king himself. The document was genuine, the royal seal unmistakable. Callum hadn't just been a captain. He had been the captain who negotiated the peace treaty that ended 20 years of bloodshed. He had chosen obscurity not out of disgrace, but out of exhaustion. And now, to save an orc who had been cast out for showing mercy to a human child, he had unveiled himself, risking everything the pardon had given him. Urzara, bleeding in the mud, stared at him. "You ended the war," she whispered. "I helped start it," he said, "but I'm trying to end it again. Starting with you." Aldrich stared at the royal seal, his sword arm going slack. He was not a fool. He recognized the king's mark, the wax still hardened into the intricate pattern of the crown and crossed swords. The man he had come to arrest was not a traitor. He was a Lord Protector Emeritus, a living legend of the Orc Wars, the very captain who had stood beside King Aldrin III at the signing of the Highland Accord. And Aldrich had loosed a crossbow bolt at him, wounded the woman under his protection, and called him a monster in front of 30 soldiers. The political ground beneath his feet had just become a cliff edge. "My lord," Aldrich stammered, lowering his blade, "I did not know. The constable said you were a rogue, a danger. I was following orders." Callum's sword did not waver. "You were following ambition. There's a difference." He pressed the tip a fraction closer, then withdrew. "Pick up the wounded. Take your men back to Eastmarch. Tell your commander that a Lord Protector will be sending a formal complaint to the Crown about the conduct of this garrison. And then consider what kind of legacy you want to leave. Because right now, it's a crossbow bolt in the back of a woman who saved a child." The soldiers, disarmed by both the pardon and their captain's collapse of authority, obeyed. They lifted their injured comrades, avoided eye contact, and filed out of the yard with the shamed silence of men who had learned they were the villains of the story. Harlan, who had watched from the tree line, turned and fled before Callum's gaze could find him. He knew his career, perhaps his freedom, was over. The constable had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that the invisible man was powerless, when in truth he was the most powerful man in the valley, hiding in plain sight. Inside the farmhouse, Tomas worked with trembling hands to staunch the bleeding from Urzara's shoulder. The bolt had passed through cleanly, but had torn muscle. Her face was pale, sweat beading on her brow, but her eyes remained fixed on Callum as he came through the door. "You lied," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. "You let them treat you like nothing for 10 years. You could have stopped it at any time." "I didn't lie," Callum said, sheathing his sword and kneeling beside her. "I stopped being the man who kills. I chose to be invisible. The cost was being treated like nothing. I made peace with that." He took her hand, the green of his skin startling against her gray. "But some things are worth becoming visible again. You, Urzara, are one of them." Her eyes welled, but she did not cry. Orcs did not cry easily. Yet something in her face shifted, a crack in the armor that had held for decades. "The child I saved," she said suddenly, "the human girl. Her name was Ilara. She swallowed hard. She told me her father was a lord, a powerful one. She begged me not to leave her. I told her to run, to find soldiers, but I don't know if she made it." Callum's expression darkened. "That caravan was ambushed near the Silverwood Bridge. That's Baron Herrick's territory." He paused, the pieces assembling behind his eyes. "Herrick's only daughter is named Ilara. She's 7 years old. The Baron has been tearing the countryside apart looking for her. He thought the Red Scar had taken her hostage." Urzara's breath caught. "I didn't know. I just saw a child. I couldn't let them burn her alive." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. If Ilara had survived, if she had reached safety, She would have told her father about the orc woman who threw herself between her and an axe. That would mean the Baron, one of the most powerful lords in the kingdom, owed Urzara a life debt. But it also meant the Red Scar, the very crew that cast Urzara out, would be hunted by every soldier in the realm. And that meant their captain, a ruthless killer named Gorath, would do anything to eliminate the one witness who could unite the human lords and orc clans against him. Urzara had not just found refuge in a failing farm. She had become the most valuable and most targeted person in 3 territories. That night, as Thomas kept watch and Callum brewed the last of the willow bark for her pain, a new sound reached them. Not drums, not soldiers, but something older and more primal. The howl of a war horn, the deep reverberating call that orc raiding parties used to signal a kill. Bramble, the goat, bleated in terror from the barn. Urzara's eyes snapped open. That's Gorath. He's found my trail. Callum rose, moving to the window. In the distant tree line, torchlight bobbed. Too many torches to count. A full Red Scar warband, maybe 40 strong, had come to the valley. They were not here for the villagers. They were here to finish what they had started, to silence the clanless traitor who had embarrassed their captain. And they were not bound by the king's pardon, nor by any treaty. They operated outside all law, their only code being blood. "Tomas," Callum said, "take Urzara through the tunnel. Now, go to the old watchtower on the ridge and light the signal fire. If Baron Herrick is searching for his daughter, he'll see it and send riders." "What about you?" Tomas asked. Callum strapped his sword tighter, his eyes the color of dying embers. "I'm going to buy you time. Gorath doesn't know who I am. He thinks he's hunting a broken farmer. I intend to educate him." The next hour became a legend whispered in the Thornwood for generations. Callum Ashford, the man the village had ignored, the failure whose wife died because of their cruelty, met 40 Red Scar raiders in the rain-soaked yard of his farm and fought them to a standstill. He did not fight like a soldier. He fought like a ghost, slipping between shadows, using the collapsing barn and the goat pens as cover. His blade finding throats and hamstrings with the precision of a man who had killed more orcs than most soldiers had seen. He called out to them in their own language, a rough, fluent growl that he had learned during the peace negotiations. "I am Callum Ashford, the King's Blade, the man who ended the last war. You want the clanless woman? Come and claim her." Gorath, a towering brute with a scarred face and a necklace of human teeth, roared in fury and charged. But Callum was no longer the weary farmer. He was the vanguard captain, the monster of the highlands, and he fought with the cold, efficient brutality of a man who had buried that part of himself for 20 years and was now unleashing it with deliberate, terrifying control. By the time Gorath's axe shattered against the farmhouse wall, half his warband was dead or fled, and he himself was on his knees, Callum's sword at his throat. "You should have let her die in that ditch," Callum said, "because now everyone knows what she did. The Baron's daughter lives. The orc who saved her is under my protection. And you, Gorath, are going to deliver a message to the other war chiefs." He leaned closer. "The clanless woman is not clanless anymore. She is under my clan. And my clan is the King's vanguard." Gorath spat, but his eyes showed fear. Callum let him crawl away, a broken warlord carrying the news that a human farmer had dismantled his crew and declared a new order. At the ridge, Thomas had lit the signal fire. Within the hour, riders crested the hill, not soldiers, but scouts in the livery of House Herrick. Their captain, a grizzled woman named Seren, dismounted and knelt before Urzara, who was slumped against the watchtower, crossbow bolt still in her shoulder. "Are you the one who saved Lady Alara?" Saren asked. Urzara nodded weakly. "Is she alive?" "She is. She's been asking for the green lady who caught the axe. The Baron wants to meet you. He wants to thank you." Urzara looked down the ridge toward the farm, where a single torch still burned in the pre-dawn light. "Then tell him to thank the human farmer who saved me first." When Callum finally limped up the ridge, covered in orc blood and his own, the sun was rising. He found Urzara being tended by the Baron's healer, her shoulder cleaned and stitched. The riders had brought food, medicine, and a letter sealed with the Herrick crest. Saren handed it to Callum. "The Baron requests your presence at Silverwood Keep, both of you. He's calling a council. The orc clans are in chaos. The Red Scar are shattered, but other war bands are massing at the border. They've heard about the orc who turned. Some want her dead. Some want her as a symbol. What happens next will decide whether there's war or peace. And you, Lord Protector, are the only man alive who has fought orcs and brokered peace with them." Callum looked at the letter, then at Urzara. Her face was still gaunt, but her eyes held a new light. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of purpose. She had spent her life as a weapon. Now she had a chance to be a bridge. "What do you want to do?" he asked her. She met his gaze. "I want to see Alara again. I want to tell her I'm sorry I didn't get her out sooner. And I want to make sure no other child has to watch their wagon burn." She paused. "I want to be the reason the killing stops." Callum nodded slowly. "Then we go to Silverwood, together, as the sun cleared the mountains. The farmer who had been invisible and the bandit who had been cast out climbed into the Baron's carriage, carrying nothing but a blood-stained sword and a wooden goat charm that Tomas had carved for Urzara during the long night. Behind them, the farm that had been a tomb became a monument. Ahead, a council of lords and warlords waited, and the fate of two species hung on the words of two people who had learned, through fire and mercy, that monsters were made, not born, and could be unmade by a single act of grace. But what they did not yet know, what would only become clear when they arrived at the keep, was that the king himself had heard the story. And he had questions, hard ones. Questions that would test whether Callum's pardon could survive the one thing the king had never expected, a Lord Protector, who had adopted a clanless orc as his own, and who was now about to demand that the crown honor peace with those it had once called enemies. The carriage rolled east, and the kingdom held its breath. The carriage arrived at Silverwood Keep as dusk painted the towers gold. It was not the grim fortress Callum remembered from wartime maps. The Baron had rebuilt it after the Highland Accord, replacing arrow slits with stained glass, turning a bastion of death into a monument of peace. Urzara stared out the window at the guards who stood at attention, their armor polished, their spears tipped with ceremonial silver instead of war steel. She had never seen a human stronghold that didn't burn. "They're not afraid of me," she murmured. "They know who you are," Callum said. "Word travels faster than carriages. The orc who saved Alara Herrick doesn't need to fear human guards." The words felt foreign in his mouth, the idea that an orc could be welcomed. But they were true. And truth, after 10 years of lies, tasted like fresh water. The great hall was already filled when they entered. Baron Herrick stood beside his throne, a broad man with a burn scar across his jaw and eyes that had wept recently. At his side, clutching his hand with both of hers, was a child of 7. Elara's brown hair was still singed at the ends from the wagon fire, but her face lit up the moment she saw Urzara. She tore free from her father, ran across the stone floor, and threw herself at the orc's legs. "Green Lady, you're alive. I told Papa you caught the axe." "I told him. But he didn't believe me until the scouts came back. Urzara knelt, her wounded shoulder screaming, and wrapped her good arm around the girl. The hall, packed with lords, ladies, and warriors, fell silent. A human child embracing an orc bandit, it was a scene no one had imagined possible. And yet it happened, and the silence that followed was not horror, but awe. "I'm sorry I couldn't carry you out," Urzara whispered. Ilara shook her head violently. "You stopped the bad man. That's what matters. Papa says you're a hero. Are you going to stay with us?" Urzara looked up at Callum, who had stopped a few paces back, letting her have the moment. "I don't know where I'm going to stay," she said. "But I'll be your friend forever, if you want." "Forever is a long time," Ilara said solemnly. "I know. Is that okay?" Ilara considered, then nodded. "Okay, but you have to teach me how to catch axes." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the crowd. The tension cracked. The king arrived on the third morning. King Aldrin III was old now, his beard white as mountain snow, but his back was straight and his gaze sharper than any sword. He entered Silverwood with minimal ceremony, 20 guards, a scribe, and his chief advisor, and summoned Callum and Urzara to a private audience in the Baron's solar. The room was small, intimate, the walls lined with books instead of weapons. The king sat behind a simple oak desk, not a throne, and gestured for them to sit. 20 years ago, the king began, "You stood beside me at the signing of the accord. You told me that peace with the orcs was possible if we honored their clans and stopped treating them as vermin. I listened to you then. We built a treaty. And then you vanished." Callum met his gaze without flinching. "I was tired, Your Majesty. Tired of killing. Tired of being the monster they needed me to be. I thought if I disappeared, I could stop being the thing the war made me." The king nodded slowly. "I know. I've kept track of you, Callum. I knew you were in Thornwood. I chose to leave you in peace because you had earned it. But now you've resurfaced, with an orc at your side, a red scar no less, whom you call your clan. The lords are restless. The war chiefs are watching. Tell me why I should not see this as a threat to the peace we built." Urzara spoke before Callum could. Her voice was quiet, but steady, the voice of someone who had spent weeks learning to use words instead of weapons. "Your Majesty, I was born in the Red Scar. I killed humans for 15 years. I believed it was righteous because my clan told me it was. But then I saw a child, a girl, who looked at me and didn't see a monster, just someone who could help. I couldn't let her burn. For that, my own captain stabbed me and left me to die. If a human farmer hadn't found me, I would be dead. He had every reason to finish what Gorath started. Instead, he fed me. He said I wasn't a monster. No one had ever said that to me before." She paused, her hand moving to her chest, where the scar was still healing. "I don't want war. I want what Ilara wanted, someone to see me and not run. If that threatens your peace, then your peace was already broken." The king leaned back. The scribe's quill scratched furiously. "You're asking me to believe that an orc can change her nature," the king said, not unkindly. "I'm asking you to believe that nature isn't fixed." Callum answered. "You and I, we were both soldiers. We both did terrible things. But we chose to stop. She chose to stop, and she nearly died for it. Isn't that exactly what the Accord promised? That orcs and humans could choose differently? You signed that treaty with me because we believed it. Now we have proof, bleeding, scarred proof, that it works. Don't abandon it, because the proof is inconvenient." A long silence followed. The king stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the valley. "Gorath is dead. Herrick's scouts found his body in the Thornwood, killed by his own warband after he fled from you. The Red Scar have scattered. Other clans are already sending emissaries, asking if the rumors are true, that a human lord and a clanless orc have formed a new alliance. Some want to join it, some want to destroy it. What happens next will define the next generation. He turned. Callum Ashford, I cannot give you an army, but I can give you a charter. A new clan, recognized by the crown, a clan not of blood, but of choice, for any orc who renounces violence and seeks a different path. You will be its founder. Urzara, formerly of the Red Scar, will be its first member. And you will have the protection of the crown as long as you uphold the accord. Urzara's knees buckled. She caught herself on the arm of the chair. A clan, she breathed. A real clan. With a name. The name is yours to choose, the king said. What will you call it? She looked at Callum, and for the first time since that night behind the woodpile, she smiled. A full, unguarded smile that rearranged the architecture of her face. Ashwood, she said, for the farmer and the Thornwood. That's where we started. That's our clan. The scribe wrote it down. The charter was sealed before noon. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall the next day. Hundreds gathered, lords, soldiers, orc emissaries who had traveled under flags of truce. Callum stood beside Urzara as the king read the charter aloud, his voice carrying to every corner. When the final words were spoken, Urzara knelt and swore an oath in growl, the ancient words of clan binding, and Callum answered in the same tongue, his accent rough but true. Then he placed his hand on her shoulder, the warrior's blessing, and pulled her into a rough embrace. You're not clanless anymore, he said, and neither am I. The hall erupted, not in cheers exactly, but in something deeper, the sound of a future being born. Ilara clapped until her hands hurt, and the orc emissaries who had come expecting to find weaklings instead found a new power, one built on mercy rather than blood. But the most surprising moment came after the ceremony, when a servant brought a message to Callum. It was from Harlan, the constable, now imprisoned for false accusation and inciting violence. He had written a letter, scrawled on cheap parchment, asking for forgiveness. I was blind, the letter read. I needed someone to hate because hating you was easier than hating myself. Please, tell the orc woman I'm sorry. Urzara read it in silence. Then she looked at Callum. What do we do with him? Callum thought for a long moment. We let him go. Not because he deserves it, but because we don't want to be the kind of clan that takes revenge. The cycle has to break somewhere. Let it break with us. So Harlan was released, stripped of his title, sent to live in obscurity, much like Callum had been. But he was given a chance to start over, and that was more than he had ever given anyone. The symmetry was not lost on the villagers of Thornwood, who had gathered outside the keep gates to see the new Lord Protector and his orc partner. They had come with fear, expecting punishment for years of neglect. Instead, Callum walked among them, recognized faces he had once avoided, and spoke quietly. I don't blame you. You didn't know what I was. But now you know what we're building. There's a place in it for anyone who wants to help. The war is over. The real work begins. That spring, the Ashwood farm was rebuilt, not by soldiers, but by the villagers themselves. Tomas led the effort, and Bramble the goat supervised from the highest pile of timber. The house expanded, the barn straightened, and the root cellar became a council room where humans and orcs sat at the same table and argued about grain supplies. Urzara's shoulder healed fully, and she began training as a mediator, learning the languages of the Highland clans to bring more into the charter. Ilara visited every week, bringing drawings and questions about axes, and slowly, inevitably, The farm became a home for children of both species, orphans of raids, runaways, those who had no clan. They called it Ashwood Refuge, and its banner was a goat holding a broken chain. One evening, as summer warmed the valley, Callum and Urzara stood on the ridge where the signal fire had burned. Below them, the farm glowed with lantern light, laughter drifting up on the wind. It had been a year since that first night behind the woodpile. "Do you ever miss being invisible?" Urzara asked. "Sometimes," Callum said. "But then I remember that invisible people can't catch anyone when they fall." He looked at her. "You caught Alara. You caught me. I think the world needs more visible people, not fewer." She leaned her head against his arm, no longer flinching from touch. "That's a very wise thing for a farmer to say. I'm not just a farmer. I'm the founder of a clan. I have to be at least a little wise or the goat will stage a coup." The goat, as it happened, did stage a coup. But that's a story for another time. What mattered now was that the king's charter held, the clans slowly shifted, and a new generation grew up knowing that mercy was not weakness, but the hardest strength of all. And in the crumbling farmhouse where two invisible people had once wept into a threadbare tunic, a new family had risen, not of blood, but of choice. And that, as Urzara told the children every night, was the strongest clan there was. Now, the story doesn't end here. Because the peace they built faced its first true test when a warlord from the Highlands arrived with an ultimatum. That warlord's name was Kethra Stonehand, and she spoke for 7 clans who believed the Ashwood Charter was a threat to the old ways. She gave them 3 days to disband or face annihilation. It was the first test, and it would not be the last. But Callum and Urzara had faced worse tests before. They had faced a village that ignored him, a crew that tried to kill her, a garrison that wanted them both in chains. They had already learned that the hardest battles aren't won with swords. They're won with words, with stubborn refusal to become what the world expected. The ultimatum didn't break them. It proved, once and for all, that mercy was not a weakness, it was the only foundation strong enough to build a future on. The story of the starving Orc Bandit and the invisible farmer is not just a tale of 2 people, it's a mirror. How many of us walk through life unseen, convinced that our failures define us? How many of us carry wounds from a past we never chose? Callum spent a decade believing he was nothing. Urzara spent 15 years killing because she thought she had no other purpose. They found each other at the exact moment both were ready to die. And instead, they lived. Not easily, not perfectly, but together. They proved that the people society throws away can, when given a scrap of mercy, rebuild the whole world. That's the real twist. Not that he fed her. Not that he was a war hero. The twist is that a simple act of kindness, a piece of bread, a few words, a refusal to see a monster, can unravel decades of hatred. It can create a clan where none existed. It can change laws, move kings, and inspire children to build goat-led empires. The Ashwood Refuge still stands. The charter still holds. And somewhere right now, in a valley you've never heard of, someone is feeding an enemy, not knowing that they're planting the seeds of the next great peace. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and join us for more. Every subscription keeps these tales alive. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what you would have said if you found an enemy bleeding behind your woodpile. We read them. We remember. Until next time, remember, the people we ignore might just be the ones who save us all.